I'm delighted to be joined today by Daniel DePetris, who is a fellow at Defence Priorities and a writer at a number of places, including The Spectator, where we are always grateful for his work. And we're going to be talking about Gaza and the Middle East and, of course, Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has been in Israel today. He spoke at the Knesset, Israel's parliament. He gave what I thought was rather sort of triumphal address about having achieved a ceasefire. The hostages, of course, have been handed over today. And it felt like a historic occasion. And indeed, in many ways, it was. Daniel, your thoughts, firstly. Do you think Donald Trump was justified in sounding as triumphant as he did today?
Well, thank you, Freddie, for having me. Look, I think Trump is very legitimately happy with his diplomatic initiatives. He's tried very, very strongly and forcefully over the last several months to kind of poke and prod to see if there was an opportunity to strike an agreement between two irascible parties who obviously have zero trust in between each other. And, in many ways, you can argue that Trump did something that his predecessor, Joe Biden, couldn't do during his own time in office, which was get all the living hostages released. With that being said, I don't think we are anywhere near the comprehensive peace in the Middle East that Trump and his advisors have been proclaiming over the last 5 or 6 days. We are in phase one of a probably 2 or 3, 4 phase agreement that will be very, very difficult to implement, negotiate, and carry through. It's going to take a lot of work to determine whether this is actually going to get across the finish line, and we are nowhere near that. Phase one, yes. Phase 2, 3, and 4, it's still to be determined.
But the handing back of the hostages is significant because that was Hamas's key bit of leverage over Israel, and it was also Israel's moral justification or the moral justification they would use to whenever they were heavily criticized was they'd say, well, why don't they give back the hostages? It is incumbent now on Israel to pursue peace in a way perhaps it wasn't before.
It's possible. The question is, Netanyahu obviously has a little more leverage, given that the hostages are now in the hands of their loved ones back in Israel. As you mentioned, Hamas really only had one bargaining chip, and that was the hostages. And they decided that, or they came to a determination that keeping those hostages was more, it was more of a cost on their long-term interest than a benefit, which was not the case several months prior. The thing is with Netanyahu is you never really know what his determinations are. His long-term strategic outlook is very muddled. I don't think he has a long-term strategy. It's very, very day-to-day. He will ultimately do whatever is in his political interest. So if he has a hard-right coalition government, which he does presently, he has an incentive to kind of stonewall any negotiation that could result in a two-state solution. If there's a new government in Israel next year, and Bibi is still holding the office of prime minister, or if we have a different Israeli prime minister, the incentive structure will change. But right now, we still have Bibi as prime minister, and he's a very short-term thinker, in my opinion.
Well, let's discuss the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, because we're often told, we're led to understand that there are tensions between the two, that Trump's unhappy about Netanyahu. Some things, there was the why are you so effing negative story that I think Axios reported a couple of weeks ago, maybe last week it was. Today they got into the Beast together. They had 45 minutes in the Beast together, and there were a lot of people speculating that Trump had a face like thunder when he met Netanyahu's wife. He didn't. He had his sort of angry face on, and people like Steve Bannon were saying that. But then you hear him in the chamber giving this address to the Knesset, and all you hear is, free, give Bibi a pardon to the president, which was quite a funny thing to say, and genuinely a sort of fraternal mood between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration, and a sort of an obvious closeness between Steve Witkoff, his Trump envoy, and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and a key player in these negotiations, and a sort of general feeling of fraternity between the Israeli government and Netanyahu.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing. I mean, in private, you kind of speculate that they are having very difficult discussions between the two, Trump and Netanyahu. Um, it's also kind of interesting that the personal relationship is as good today as it is, because when you look at the interests of Israel and the United States in the Middle East, in a lot of countries, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's establishing a wider network of diplomatic relations between Arab states and Israel, Trump and Bibi Netanyahu were not always 100% aligned in private. And Syria is a perfect example of this, where Trump has essentially endorsed the new Syrian government led by Ahmad al-Sharaa, who is, of course, a former Al-Qaeda fighter 20 years ago. And of course, Netanyahu views Sharaa as sort of a wolf in sheep's clothing. He's still a jihadist at heart. So there are differences between the United States and Israel. But it is interesting that you bring up their public kind of persona. They are very comfortable with each other in public. I suspect in private, they're a little more divergent, and they have hard conversations. That's just speculation coming from me, but I have a very hard time believing that they are as positive between the two behind closed doors as they are in front of the cameras.
And another thing that struck me in Trump's speech was when he talked about the Iran strikes. He loves talking about the mission and how beautifully executed it was and so on, and how great the bombers are. But he was certainly talking about it as though it was an important part of the peace process, which isn't exactly what we were led to understand at the time. I mean, what we were led to understand at the time is that Israel and Iran were going at each other and Trump was playing the role of peacemaker. So what explains the incongruity, if you like, between what Trump was saying today and what Trump was saying when the very brief Iran-Israel war was going on?
Well, I don't think there's any rational explanation, to be quite frank with you. I mean, Trump says one thing one week, he does a complete 180 rhetorical degree the next week. So this is kind of a pattern where he's not working off a unified theory of the case, right? It's actually similar to Bibi, where he's very short-term thinking, and he will say things and do things that are help his perception as a strong man, as a world leader, and as the world's quote unquote master deal maker. I don't think the Iran file had anything to do with what is happening in Gaza right now. I think that was kind of a throwaway line for Trump, essentially rationalizing his decision back in June to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, which if we can have a whole nother podcast discussion on that, because it was sort of another instance of a 180-degree turn where he had negotiations with the Iranians, where he basically decided to quit those negotiations and back up Israel, when they launched their 12-day military campaign in Tehran and other Iranian cities. So I don't think there was a coherent linkage between the two. This is just Trump trying to kind of pat himself on the back as he's speaking to the Knesset.
Yes, and it's also to his tendency to sort of declare victory before victory is declared, and to actually achieve victory through just positive thinking. This is very important to him. And you could see it in the way he was talking about Iran. He was saying, we'll get the Abraham Accords back up and going again, presumably referring to an Israeli-Saudi alliance, although he didn't specifically mention that. And then he said, why not we can bring in Iran too? And there was a sort of mixed reaction among the Israeli politicians gathered. But this is to Trump's credit to some extent. Yes, it's all perhaps short-termist, but it's also in the direction of peace. He's always looking to leverage his deal-making abilities towards peace.
I will give Trump credit for one thing, and it's something that previous presidents have been reticent to do during their own tenures. He will talk to anybody. He will talk to the Iranians. He will talk to the North Koreans. He will talk to the Venezuelans. So it doesn't matter how bad the bilateral relationship is between the United States and an adversarial country. He always has the diplomatic option in his back pocket. So I give him credit for not tying his hands behind his back, which previous presidents have done. That's a different sort of question, whereas just because you're willing to talk to somebody doesn't obviously necessarily mean that you're going to strike an agreement with those people. So again, we have sort of a notion where Trump will keep diplomacy as an option, but the way he goes about diplomacy doesn't necessarily result in long-term success. And we saw that with the Iranians, where he was willing to speak to them through 5 or 6 rounds of negotiations over a period of months. And then he just got bored or tired or just irritated about their position and went a completely different direction from where he started out with. So, for somebody like me who's kind of interested in the history of U.S. foreign policy and try to project what could happen in the future, it's very difficult to determine what Trump is going to do at any given time. And I guess that's the fun of it. And it's also frustrating beyond belief, as you can imagine.
Well, one of the themes has been of the second Trump administration, and the first too, actually, has been involving the Gulf states more, involving the UAE, involving Qatar, involving Saudi Arabia in trying to resolve the difficulties in their region. And this makes sense from a strategic point of view, is you getting regional players involved in solving conflicts in their area is a sensible strategy. And you could see from the speech today, and you could see from the talks in Egypt and so on, Trump's now in Egypt, I believe, and it is very much a united front for diplomacy between the Gulf states, in coordination with Israel at the very least, and America. And this is something that has changed from between Trump and previous American presidents, I'd say.
I think you're right. I mean, Trump really wants other countries to take more responsibility for their own neighborhood. And this isn't exclusive to the Middle East. You hear this is a common Trumpian theme going back to 2015, 2016 campaign, where he's essentially tells the American people that, the United States is a sucker, taking care of dozens of countries around the world. They should be doing more for themselves. So this really is sort of implementing his own ideology to the extent that he has one. In the Middle East, it's actually, I think, going further along than I would think. He's got the Saudis on board, the Qataris, the Emiratis. They all seem to be working off a similar blueprint on Gaza, at least. That's not necessarily to say that everybody agrees with everything in the region, but on Gaza specifically, Trump did considerable amounts of work to get the Arabs on board. And if you believe public reporting, the reason Hamas signed on, or one of the reasons Hamas signed on to this latest ceasefire, is because the Arabs were much tougher on Hamas than they were 4 or 5 months ago. So it's having an impact. It's just, again, we don't know if that impact is going to be long lasting. So we'll have to monitor that.
Well, I suppose one thing that people are saying, and there is a degree of truth to it, is that conventional diplomacy as we know it is increasingly redundant in the modern world, and that this sort of very business-orientated, deal-making Trump approach to diplomacy does seem to be effective. You're quite right to point towards the long term, but it certainly is able to be disruptive, to make progress in areas where conventional diplomacy seems to have failed. And that's because it's about the business of business. It's about investments. Trump is very keen on talking to Gulf states about how much money they're willing to invest in America. And there is a sort of understanding that this is how you work with Trump. You talk business, you talk about large amounts of money, you talk about construction projects, you talk about real estate. And Trump, in turn, will ensure that you get your interests advanced if you're willing to help America's. And I mean, it's sort of very confusing to people who are used to thinking about diplomacy in traditional ways, but it is working.
It's working to an extent. I remember during the first term when Trump went to was it Vietnam, right? When he went to have that direct discussion with Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, about the nuclear file. And that was another instance of Trump sort of trying to be a transactionalist, right? I'll lift all U.S. sanctions if you basically give away your nuclear weapons program, which has been the U.S. policy for 35, 40 years now. But the way Trump did it was, like, as you point out, very transactionalist and businesslike. In that circumstance, it didn't work, right? Because Kim Kim Jong-un, excuse me, had made a determination that it just the deal that was on offer just didn't make sense for him. In Gaza, it seems to have worked for the short term. So Hamas, Hamas gets a degree of quiet. Gaza gets a degree of quiet. The Israelis get their hostages released. Everybody wins in the first phase. Again, the question is, after the first phase, what happens? And those are long-term to medium-term questions that haven't been negotiated yet between Hamas and Israel. So Trump is a very impatient man. He wants deals quickly. He wants deals, immediately, efficiently, and of course, he wants to brag about them, which he's doing right now. So, in a way that's great. It spurs diplomacy. In another way, it could turn out to be problematic if the nuts and bolts of a deal aren't sufficiently discussed, and that's what I'm concerned about.
Well, I know you said it's a subject for another podcast, and we probably should do another podcast on it. But Iran does seem to be the next big question in that region. I think another big question, of course, is Ukraine on the world stage. But in that region, Iran will be, if the peace process proceeds according to plan, or whatever vague plan it may be, Iran will have to be an important part of the jigsaw going forward, as they say. And it's another point that addresses what you're talking about, that Donald Trump loves to claim success in the instance. And so he talks about the bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities as an unequivocal win. And yet, if you look at what's going on in Iran, the dynamics of the Iranian situation have not changed. They are still pursuing nuclear weapons, it seems. We are still talking about what sanctions the West can apply on Iran to stop it developing nuclear weapons. The strikes were not an unqualified success if you look at it objectively. Am I right?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, they certainly did damage to the three main Iranian nuclear facilities in Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. But the purpose of the military operation back in June wasn't just to destroy or heavily damage these facilities, in my opinion. It was also to change Iran's strategic calculus and kind of force them to rethink their maximalist position on nuclear weapons and the nuclear program writ large. And that hasn't happened, as you rightly point out. The Iranians are still very insistent that they have the right to enrich uranium on their soil. The Trump administration takes the exact opposite view, basically saying you have no right to do this whatsoever. So the bottom line diplomatic positions have not changed whatsoever. The best that we've done is kind of kick the can down the road for, the administration says 2 years. I don't know if that's necessarily accurate. I've heard assessments that maybe the Iranian nuclear program is back by 6 months. Again, it's a delaying tactic. It's not a comprehensive resolution to a problem that has bedeviled the international community for 30 years. So again, short-termism. The long-term solution is still not within our grasp.
Well, I think as Warren Buffett said, a long-term bet is a short-term bet that hasn't come good yet. But Daniel, I think I would also, just before we go, I wanted to ask you a little bit about Chicago, because I know you write about the Chicago Tribune, because there is a possible article lurking in perhaps in the pages of Spectator soon, that Trump is establishing peace abroad, but perhaps civil war would be an exaggeration, but certainly deep civil unrest at home. And there's a lot of talk about invoking the Insurrection Act to curb the protests, the anti-ICE protests in American cities, and Chicago seems to be heating up in particular. I mean, it does feel a bit like he's off in the Middle East declaring peace, and things may be heating up at home.
Yeah, it's a very strange dichotomy. And as an American, this is just an impartial statement. This is not meant to be partisan or politicized. It's just very odd, because this is sort of a way where you look at the world as sort of a burning couch that's on fire, and as America as some sort of beacon shining city on the hill, as Reagan used to say. Whereas today, everything, just the general atmosphere, is heavily politicized and partisan, and it's to the point where you can't even discuss political questions with any reason or rationality. And, just as an anecdote, my family is half Republican, half Democrat, right? We used to be able to discuss civilly political questions, and we've come to the decision as a family that we're just going to leave politics to the side and not even discuss politics anymore. And I'm afraid that's sort of where we are as a country. A lot of families are probably going through the same transition. It's not a good place to be in, that's for sure.
No. Well, on that note, let's stop talking politics. Dan, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast. Great pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for your very valuable insight.
Thank you very much.